Generally, the possessions of citizens are private, and citizens possess land privately, though they can and should make some of their land and possessions common in use in the ways indicated. But what limitations with respect to amount or use should there be on private property? Aristotle obviously advocates limits on the criminal use of property, but what else? A good place to begin with is the first two necessary offices. Aristotle says, first, is the superintendence concerning the market, for which there should be some office overseeing agreements and orderliness. It is clear that their main functions are to see that everyone involved is honest and holds to their agreements and contracts, and that orderliness is maintained. But Harrison writes that in Athens' market, supervisors also fix certain prices. In Athenian Constitution 51, which describes this office, although the emphasis is on preventing fraud and dishonesty, there is some mention of price fixing, especially regarding the price of wheat. Rhodes, commenting on this section, writes that Athens had relied on imported corn, that is wheat, to supplement the local crop, and to ensure that the citizens should be fed. The state was led to take a special interest in the corn trade. The importers were not free to sell their corn wherever they could get the highest price for it. It is unclear whether Aristotle advocates any of this, but he may. In general, though, the limits on private property implied by this necessary office are not that intrusive. In fact, one main concern is the protection of private property against fraudulent activity in the marketplace. The second necessary office is town management. This office seems to have three functions. The first, superintendence of private and public property in town, with a view to ensuring orderliness. The second, superintendence of the preservation and repair of decaying buildings and roads. And third, the prevention of boundary disputes. Barnes complains, what exactly is the function of these officials with regard to private houses? May they do no more than 1. Order the repair of dilapidated property when it endangers neighbors or passerbys? Example, may they instruct me to mend my tottering chimneys? Or may they also, 2. Regulate any alterations or repairs I make to my house which could in any way affect third parties? Example, may they require me to paint the external woodwork in a seemly color? Or may they further, 3. Determine how I deal with the internal affairs of my house, affairs which affect only its occupants? Example, may they prohibit me from installing an electric socket in my bathroom? These three possibilities marked out, for the modern thinker, 3 different attitudes to political liberty. Possibility 1 illustrates an old-fashioned liberalism. Possibility 3 illustrates a new-fashioned paternalism. Any theorist who interests himself in political liberty must take a stand on these questions. Aristotle takes no stand. Is this fair? True, there is much that is unclear, but can we say nothing? Must we conclude that Aristotle takes no stand? I am not so sure. Function 3 above clearly applies only to what is happening outside of the house. As for functions 1 and 2, the Athenian constitution might shed some light. They prevent buildings which encroach on the streets, balconies which extend over the streets, overhead drain pipes which discharge into the street, and window shutters which open onto the street. Much of this no doubt describes function 2. As for function 1, Aristotle may have seen it implied in the other two functions. Seeing to it that my drain pipes do not throw water onto passerbys and preventing boundary disputes do promote public orderliness. In any event, of the 3 possibilities mentioned by Barnes above, although it is unclear whether Aristotle would have embraced 1 or 2, we have no reason to believe he would have accepted 3. Given the nature of the first necessary office, the description of the second necessary office in the Athenian constitution, and even the discussions of the second office in Plato's laws, there is no indication of any of the sort of paternalism described by Barnes. Again, the limits on property are not so intrusive. So to this extent, at least, Aristotle does take a stand. Thus, the superintendence of market and property does not imply any great restrictions or limitations on private property. We cannot conclude, however, that Aristotle had anything like a laissez-faire view, for he seems to have advocated a ceiling on how much one may own, primarily in order to avoid what he thought were harmful disparities of wealth and poverty. Especially, it should be added, in non-ideal situations. In fact, given his distinction between natural and unnatural acquisition of wealth, even in the best city he would have put a limit on the acquisition of wealth. It is unclear, however, what kind of restriction this implies. Would wealthy citizens be taxed? Would any money they made over the ceiling be handed over to the city? In the best city, some citizens would be wealthy, but they would most likely not be able to acquire an unnatural amount of wealth because citizens are forbidden the merchant's or businessman's life. Of course, this is itself a restriction on property. Although there may be limits to wealth, Aristotle is obviously not eliminating the wealthy altogether. In fact, they are a crucial part of the city. Moreover, he opposes and deems unjust the confiscation of the property of wealth, at least in the confiscation of anything below the limit on the acquisition of wealth. Sustenance for the needy, as we have seen, should ideally come from generosity in the common lands, not, in the best circumstances at least, from the redistribution of wealth. Is this to say Aristotle is against taxes? Some passages certainly imply that the wealthy may be taxed for political and especially military functions, but at other places he writes as if taxes are certainly not ideal. This apparent discrepancy can be resolved in the following way. Aristotle believes that in the very best situations, funds from common lands, the generosity of citizens, and so forth, will cover all the city expenses. But this is not very usual or likely. Normally, even in the best of cities, funds from common lands will cover much of the city's expenses, but some wealth from the richest citizens will be needed to cover what is left, especially if a lot of money is required for the military. To acquire such funds, taxes should be employed. It seems that in most cases Aristotle believes that a citizen's property, any that does not go above the certain ceiling on wealth, is that citizen's to use, so long as he does not use it fraudulently, and as long as there are enough funds for the city to function properly. If there are not, the wealthy citizens would have to give some of their wealth to the state to meet these needs. Section 5. What then did Aristotle mean when he said that they, the citizens, become such as to use the possession in common, that is, a special function of the legislator? The only cogent answer is public education. The legislator may make laws controlling the upbringing of children, both by making laws that will properly influence them, and through the establishment of a system of public education. As a result, when they become adult citizens, they will, generally, be of such character that they will freely share their property with friends and fellow citizens in the ways described in Section 4. As we have seen, at least with respect to property, Aristotle is critical of any substantial deprivation of freedom. Because of the fundamental importance of education in the life of the city, however, he advocates a coercive education of the young. In the Politics, he claims that the legislator must make the education of the young his object above all. He goes on to say that, since there is one end for the whole city, or the city as a whole, it is clear that education must necessarily be one and the same for all, and that the superintendence of it should be common and not private. This latter being the manner in which each individual at present superintends his own offspring privately and teaches them whatever private learning he thinks best. For common things the training too should be made common. At the same time one ought not even consider that some citizen is of himself or belongs to himself, but that all citizens are of the city, or belong to the city, for each is a part of the city. It is better to have a lack of freedom in one important area, in the education of one's child, than in the whole of one's life. This education may be coercive, Aristotle would agree, but it makes possible independent and responsible citizens who do not have to be coerced in every aspect of their lives. Moreover, it is better to have a city made up of good citizens, each of whom is free to use his property as he sees fit, but who will most likely use it properly, because of his character, feelings of friendship, and so on, than laws strictly regulating the use of private property or abolishing it altogether. This is what Aristotle has in mind when he says, contra Plato, "It is strange for one who intends to introduce education and who thinks that through this the city will be excellent, to suppose that it can be set right by these sorts of things, but not by habits, or character, philosophy, and laws." Platonic civic unity is achieved through these sorts of things, namely, laws forcing humans to share property in common, to treat each other as brothers, and the like. Aristotelian unity, however, is achieved through character, philosophy, and laws, that is, through laws and public education that properly shape the character of the citizens, but then allow these citizens to act independently, control their own property, and so on. Section 6. While much remains unclear, we can understand a lot more about Aristotle's remarks on property than Barnes thinks possible. We know that Aristotle believes private property must exist and that it must be respected. Although Aristotle does not defend absolute property rights, the limits to the use of property are few, especially when considered in their historical context. So Aristotle is no classical liberal, he is no Lockean, but he is much closer to this than many believe. This having been said, it is nevertheless difficult to paint Aristotle with any kind of modern brush. First, Aristotle wants to accept some key aims of modern liberalism, for example, seeing to it that every citizen receives at least basic sustenance, but he would like to avoid what are usually regarded as necessary means to such aims: strong limitations on property and the redistribution of wealth. In addition, the way he defends private property seems different from modern liberalism and socialism, and yet his defense of a citizen's freedom to use his property as he wants depends on a rather non-classical liberal institution, a coercive system of public education. Thus, we cannot subsume Aristotle's conception of property under any one modern theory. In the end, perhaps, the best label for his theory of property is Aristotelian.